All right, hello. With another Stopping Socialism video, I'm Donald Kendal, joined by Justin Haskins over here. We're coming to you to talk about how an update on the renewable energy debate. It is over. Put a fork in it. It is done.
Mission
Uh,
accomplished, Donald.
mission accomplished. Michael Moore, for those that don't know what we're talking about, Michael Moore came out with a documentary recently. He was the executive producer on the documentary called Planet of the Humans, where the vast majority of the documentary revolved around how wind and solar, or just renewable energy in general, is a terrible replacement for fossil fuels. Now, of course, he ramps this up to a very socialist, communist, anti-human point that he makes at the end. But like literally 95% of this documentary is about how wind and solar are terrible replacements. They're inefficient and they're environmentally disastrous. So, I mean, the debate's over, right, Justin?
Yeah, it's over. It's over. Thank God. I'm tired of having this conversation. When I first started learning about renewable energy, because I was never super interested in that idea. But when I first started learning about it, I remember Isaac Orr, who's what is his actual title anyway?
He is a research fellow.
He's
at
a
the
research
Center
fellow
of the American Experiment.
Right, which is a great think tank. We love Isaac. We've known Isaac for a long time. He's an expert on all things energy, but specifically renewable energy and how it affects the economy and that sort of thing. I mean, he's an expert in this field. And I remember when the Green New Deal first started emerging in late 2018 or so. And I first brought the Green New Deal up with Isaac, and I said, what do you think of this, Isaac? What do you make? And he literally didn't want to talk about it because he thought it was so laughably ridiculous, completely impossible to put forward. And then one of the really interesting things he brought up in the first conversation I had with him is that it would actually be horrible for the environment. It would be really, really bad for the environment. And that was something that struck me as being really strange, because I just always assumed wind and solar was better for the environment. It was just really expensive. But it turns out that's actually not true. Not only is it wildly inefficient, but it's also really bad for the planet. And in this documentary, what's so surprising about it is they're very honest on both of those counts. So it's just a really interesting documentary.
I mean, let's run through some of that. And for further context, I think most people that are probably listening to this know who Michael Moore is, right? Big liberal documentary filmmaker.
Emphasis on big.
That's true.
He's very big.
Bowling for Columbine, which was a gun control one. He did Fahrenheit 9/11, which was basically about how George Bush caused 9/11. I forget exactly what that one was.
Something like that. I don't know.
He did Sicko, which is about universal health care, right? So he comes out with this, and I thought maybe some of this, because we heard rumblings that there was going to be critical of wind and solar. Yep. I thought maybe it was going to be at the last 15 minutes, but right. The point that we need to save the world from climate change is the overarching point of this documentary. Absolutely not. 95% of it was about how wind and solar were terrible. So let's just kind of list off a number of the ways that he kind of goes through some of this. Some of it wasn't highlighted quite as much. We did an entire episode of In the Tank podcast on this, how I don't think that it went far enough in its criticism, but just land usage. For solar panel farms or wind farms, you'd need a lot of land. For battery backup farms, you need a lot of land to build on. For the energy transmission lines, you need a lot of land, so that's one of the big ones. Then they also go into a lot about mining, because what people might not know is wind and solar requires a lot of rare earth elements. How do you get that? You got to dig them up out of the ground. So things that environmentalists aren't necessarily keen on. So those are a couple. They don't touch on the how they're bird rotisseries or some of these solar farms, or how they the wind turbines knock birds out of the air. They don't talk about that too much. But some of these other things that just they don't get talked about. What do you do when a solar panel runs out? You realize, these people now, they realize solar panels and wind turbines, they don't last forever. Maybe 10, 20 years. You got to do something with it. Can't just throw them in the garbage. Well, with wind turbines, you have to throw them in the garbage. But solar panels, they're made with these rare earth elements that can seep into the ground if you just throw them in the trash. So they basically turn into toxic material. These things aren't talked about. And Michael Moore, with his documentary, shines the light directly on these things.
Yeah,
it's pretty wild.
And with the wind turbines in particular, you're right. You do have to throw them in the trash. You can't recycle them though. So once they're made, they're so strong, they're so powerful, and it makes sense, right? But you would have to make something. These are massive things standing in gigantic fields that are meant to they put them in the windiest places that they can possibly find, right? So you have to build these things so that they're very strong and last for a long time. So then you can't just take them apart and turn them into, soda cans or something like that.
Right.
They end up in these gigantic graveyards, essentially, where you just have these giant pits full of huge wind turbines. I mean, that's essentially what happens to these things. So you can't recycle them. Which means it's really not a sustainable path forward. You can't rely on this forever because you would need, hundreds of thousands of these things and millions over a long period of time if you're going to run the whole country on it. And where are you going to put all of this stuff? I mean, there's just no place to put it after it's done. So what I loved about it, there's so many things I love about the documentary, but the most important thing, and this is why it's mission accomplished, is that no matter what happens from this point forward, you can always tell, you have that annoying friend at work, not really our work because the people we work with, this isn't really a problem, but you have that annoying friend at work or that neighbor, that crazy uncle or whoever who's super into green energy, and you tell them it's really expensive, it's bad for the planet, whatever, they just don't believe you. Yeah. Now all you have to do is say, Michael Moore agrees with me, Right. If he's not some crazy right-wing guy. He agrees with me. So it's not just people like us, who are supposedly just stooges for the Koch brothers or whatever. It's now Michael Moore and people like that too are admitting that this stuff doesn't actually work. And you know why they're admitting it? Because it doesn't actually work. That's why. It's really not complicated.
Yeah, I mean, this is the equivalent of Bernie Sanders coming out with a documentary about how universal health care is bad. Like, this is the equivalent of like Ron Paul coming out and saying that we need communism or something.
Yeah.
Like, it's just so polar opposite of what you would expect that you can't just ignore it. And the thing that drives me nuts about this is like, this should be getting like so much more attention than it's getting, but like the coronavirus is drowning it out. It's drowning it out. So yes, the debate is over. If somebody comes to you and you find yourself in a debate about why solar or wind isn't a good replacement for reliable energy, this is it. You just pull this card out. Michael Moore made a whole documentary about why you're wrong.
That's exactly right. It's incredible. And you're right. It's true. It would be very much like if, in fact, Ron Paul's not even a good example because Ron Paul isn't even as mainstream as Michael Moore. Like within liberalism, Michael Moore is totally mainstream. It's like, it would be like, I mean, I honestly don't know if I can even think of a comparison. I mean, there's nobody on the right who's ever done anything like this. Not like this. Not where they've taken a core conservative topic and completely flip the script on it. You know, it just, and you don't really see this on the left either. You just never see this. It just is so rare. And you pointed out, if it wasn't for coronavirus, this would be a massive, massive, massive story. And it would be, because it's that big of a deal. The only reason it's not getting the kind of coverage it deserves is because A, a lot of people on the left probably don't want it to get a lot of coverage. And B, coronavirus is all anyone wants to talk about. And so it makes perfect sense. I mean, it's very difficult to break through that bubble, right? But this is a huge, huge story. And it's going to last forever, because the thing with renewable energy is you can't fix the problems, at least most of the problems that Michael Moore talks about in this. Not Michael Moore, Jeff Gibbs and Michael Moore and the other producers of the movie. There's nothing that you can do to solve a lot of these problems. These problems are not going to get better over time. Even if you can somehow make it more affordable or whatever, or pump lots of government subsidies into it, it's not going to change the fact that it's incredibly unreliable. It's not going to change the fact that you have to destroy the planet in order to rely on this. And they don't even get into all of the details that you and I love to talk about either. So it's really incredible. It really is. If you haven't seen it, check it out. I'm sure we can put it in the show notes, a link to the video.
We dedicated 2 episodes of the In the Tank podcast to this. I think it was episode 240 and 241. So if you want to see us talk about this in length, you can go and check those out. But the other thing that's magnificent about this is it basically puts the people that buy this renewable energy stuff in a corner where they either have to cast aside Michael Moore and try to like label him a shill for big oil or something like that, or they have to embrace the more kind of sinister side of what he's talking about, which we could probably elaborate on that in a future episode of this. But like, you know, the idea of population control and really controlling society to make sure that we don't need the amount of energy that we're currently using. So it really puts the left in a bind. They have to go one direction or the other. So it's a pretty amazing thing that Michael Moore has done.
It is.
Stuff that we've talked about on like shows like this and the podcast all the time. And now they have to take it serious because of him saying it.
For years and years and years, we've been saying that the logical end to all of this stuff is you need fewer people. That's the logical end. And it's not that this is some right-wing, you know, conspiracy or whatever. If you actually listen to what the hardcore environmentalists going back 40, 50, 60 years and even earlier than that were saying, that's what they were saying. I mean, you can find this in the 1960s and 70s, people saying there's too much pollution, too many humans. We got to do something about this. We're destroying Mother Earth, blah, 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 blah. And now, you see that coming out in the modern environmental movement, because the modern environmental movement has largely tried to stay away from that because I think they learned their lesson from the past. It's really, really unpopular and scary when you start talking about population control, and even limiting the number of human beings that you have. People get really, really nervous about that. And so they don't really talk about it. But you and I for years have been saying that's the only way to get what they really want. Yeah. It's not clean energy. That's nonsense, because you can have clean energy, but you have lots of human beings running around, and clean energy isn't going to solve that problem, right? They're still building buildings. They're staring down trees. They have to grow food, all of this stuff that you also hear them talk about without talking about population control measures and things like that. So it was only a matter of time before this actually happened.
Yeah.
And really the sad part of it is because it's really kind of depressing, the end of the movie, in a lot of ways. If you believe what they're starting with here. I mean, if you buy their primary premise, which is that we're all going to die from climate change, is an existential threat to the world, that we have to do something about that problem. And you buy their argument basically throughout the movie that you can't do that with renewable energy. It's not going to work.
Right.
Well, then you're left with this really terrible situation where it's like, well, what do we do then? If renewable energy isn't the answer, then what do we do? Now, you and I, if we were doing this, the answer would be nuclear energy.
Sure.
It seems like common sense, right? I mean, if your primary concern is getting rid of CO2 emissions, and you don't care about how much money you spend, then nuclear energy is the obvious option. But they hate that for some reason, and they don't even talk about it in these movies. So they won't touch nuclear energy for whatever reason. So instead, they're left with this. Rather than embrace nuclear, they're stuck with this dire, like, we're all going to die kind of situation. The only way to save us is essentially for there to be fewer of us to save.
Right.
Like, that's their solution at the end of the movie. So just have fewer kids. And then when they were interviewed about this and they were asked, the interview I'm referring to specifically was one by The Hill, and they were asked, what do you think about population control? They essentially said, well, we don't like population control, but we need fewer people. So somehow we have to have fewer people, but we don't want to force anyone.
Yeah, we don't need population control. We just need to control the population. Yeah, we should get into that topic specifically in a little bit more depth in its own video or whatever. Yeah. But I just want to make sure that the point is said in this little 15-minute video. The renewable energy debate is over. Whenever you find yourself in some type of conversation about this, you just need to remember 5 words. 5 words. Michael Moore agrees with me. That's it. Planet of the Humans. Check it out. I think it's still free on YouTube. They released it on Earth Day, ironically enough. But that'll do it for this episode of Stopping Socialism. If you like our content, check us out on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel, Stopping Socialism TV. You can find our social media also on Facebook, Stopping Socialism. You can follow us on Instagram, Stopping Socialism. Justin, where can people find you?
At Justin T. Haskins on Facebook and Twitter.
Well, that's right. And go to stoppingsocialism.com. Thank you all for tuning in.